Hi, in this video we'll be looking at Sharperlight for SAP Business One. In the first part of the video we'll be looking at what the typical user experience will be like when creating or writing back data to SAP Business One for applications like Excel, the web channel, or Power BI for example. Then in the second part of the video we'll be looking at how to set up and configure the system, given that there are many options and navigating through them can be quite complex. Let's have a look at what sort of functionality is in the SAP Business One data model connector. So there's over 600 tables that you will have access to, which make up around about 36,000 fields. In other words, all the modules in SAP Business One are covered. The second point is that the data model supports SQL Server and HANA, and it's a live connection to that data. So there's no waiting for data to be populated into a warehouse. We have access to live data. The data model supports version 8.8 up to the most current, which is 10 at the time of this video. It supports user-defined tables and user-defined fields. So everything that you've customized and the modules that you've added to SAP Business One will be picked up by Sharperlight, and you can report from them and you can write back to them. There's also support for company consolidation, which means that you can combine data over multiple companies. Writeback is done through SAP's DI API Library. There is support for security and auditing. For example, you can inherit the company's security that's been set up in SAP Business One. Sharperlight supports reporting in a number of different fashions. For example, Excel, the web channel, external tools like Power BI. It has its own scheduler, and it has a RESTful service API, meaning that if you have a development team, they can consume data and you can provide data to third parties. Access to the system can be done over the internet using remote connections, and Sharperlight supports multi-tenant cloud setups as well. Scheduling and automation can be done through Sharperlight Scheduler, so emailing, workflows, integration, uploading data, etc. Sharperlight supports cross-application reporting, meaning that not only can you pull data from SAP Business One, but you can pull it from other systems, for example, Salesforce. Now let's have a look at what the typical user experience will be like if they're using the Sharperlight Excel add-in. So here's the add-in across the top here, and depending on the style of report, they'll either use value or table in most cases. Here's a profit and loss, and you can see the formulas that are bringing back live data from SAP Business One. There's also tables, so we can bring back a list from SAP Business One and then bind pivot tables and charts to the data sets. Here's another, and we're bringing back a list of customer orders. And depending on how you create your queries, you can also create drill downs. So you can drill down on the details of these rows. Let's have a look at how these queries are built up. So I'm just going to the profit and loss, and there's our formula. And if I edit that formula, you can see the query builder. In the query builder, you select the product that you would like to pull the data from. In this case, it's SAP Business One, but it could be other systems like Salesforce, for example. Once you choose the product, you can then go to tables, and you can see the tables have been organized into folders similar to what you see in SAP Business One. If you can't find the table that you're after, you can use the find down the bottom here. So basically the table is your starting point. In this case it's GL transactions. And then once you've selected your table, you can drag fields into the filter area or drag them into the output area and slowly build up your report. If it's Excel, of course, you can bind your filters to locations in the spreadsheet so that you can parameterize the reports. The end result is that I've got a company, period, and scenario, and these are driving the formulas. If I change the company like this, the report's re-extracted for that company. If I was to multi-select companies, for example, Australia and the UK, then that would be company consolidation. So this is a P&L for both companies. Let's have a look at the top customers. If I change the company, the data is extracted live from your system. In addition to reading and creating reports, you can also write back data to SAP Business One through their DI API library. Here are some of the templates that you can download from the website. For example, here's AP Purchase Invoice, and it demonstrates how you can create various patterns for writeback. For example, a combined header line, or you can write back header and line data. The concept here is that you create a writeback using the Sharperlight add-in, and you can map your data to the fields. Sharperlight will do the basic validation first and then hand over the data to SAP Business One's library to do the final validation and writeback. One of the other ways in which users can interact with SAP Business One is through the Sharperlight web channel. So here I have the sample report pack that comes with Sharperlight, and I've got the companies going down the left here, and I've created a simple age data dashboard and top customers, etc. These reports are created using Sharperlight Publisher. Moving on now to other applications, Sharperlight has the ability to provide data to third-party applications like Power BI. Here you can see that Sharperlight has a connector, and if we connect to that, all the published reports that are in Sharperlight can be used as data sources to drive Power BI. So as you can see, it's really up to the user how they want to consume the data out of SAP Business One. Let's move on to the second part of the video. We'll be looking at configuration and setting up the system. If we go to the Sharperlight website, under Solutions, you'll find SAP Business One. That's where you can find brochures and basic functionality descriptions. But what is of real interest is the Resources menu. From there, you can find Release Builds. Here you can find the Sharperlight installer. I recommend always using the 64-bit version, which I'll explain why later on. So basically what happens is you install Sharperlight on an application server, and that has connections to SAP Business One and the DI API, for example. The clients just need Sharperlight installed, and they have no connections to SAP Business One because they can use remote connections. The second menu that's of interest is the Data Models menu. This is where you can download the SAP Business One data model connector. Here is SAP Business One. Here's the data model connector. It's a single file, and I'll show how that's deployed later on. And you can also find various report packs and examples. So here's the Excel sample that I showed earlier, and there's the Writebacks and the web channel dashboard. Here we can find release notes, and the release notes basically show what's changed in the latest version of the data model. So basically download the data model at this stage, and the report packs are optional. Okay, let's start with setting up an application server. I already have Sharperlight installed on this VM, and you can see that I've already got some services there. But basically I need to stop Sharperlight if you already have an installation there. So stop the services, stop all the applications, exit Excel, and then from there you run the installer. You can see on the desktop I've got the installer and the SAP Business One data model. So first of all, of course, we need to install Sharperlight or install the latest version over the current one. Like most installers, it's simply a matter of going next. For our application server, you need to do the complete install. I recommend that you go with the default install location. If you do change it, you need to remember where that location is during each install and make sure that you install back to the same location. Some of the questions that often come up during an installation is, what will happen to my connection details from previous versions? All of those are maintained, So basically you do an upgrade and everything's still the same as it was before. The other types of questions are, if you upgrade the application server, do I need to go around and upgrade all the clients as well at the same time? That's not required. Newer versions on the applications server can talk to older versions of the clients and vice versa. So the upgrade can be spread out over a period of time. Once the install is finished, you can find the menus under the Start menu in Windows. And let's go to the Applications menu. That combines everything together in one simple list. Now that the installation is finished, what we can do is deploy the latest version of the SAP Business One data model using the Datamodel Installer. This simply copies the file to the right location. This ensures that you don't have Sharperlight running while you're trying to install and compile the latest SAP Business One data model. So here's SAP, and it's currently version 1982. And if I click on Update, I can browse for the file that's on our desktop. So you can see here it's a single file, and you can see that it's detected that it's the newer version. We'll say yes to that. If it's a completely new site, SAP Business will not be in the list, and you can use the Add button in that case. Once you have SAP Business One in the list with the preferred version, next click to Force Recompile. This compiles the file. This is why it's important to stop Sharperlight services and exit applications like Excel Publisher, for example, so that none of those files are locked. If this is not done, then applications like Writeback will start failing because the compile process couldn't complete successfully. If you want to create a shortcut on your desktop directly to Sharperlight, you can find it in the Program Files, Firelight, Sharperlight bin directory and MD applications. So if you just drag that out, you can create a direct link to the application, which I've just done. So let's click on Sharperlight again. Let's have a look at Client Setup. This is where the database connections are done. So I'm just going to disable that and enable local connections. Here is the Sharperlight database. This is where the users and reports are held for Sharperlight, and that's normally always called Sharperlight. Initially, you would create a blank database in Microsoft SQL Server, and if you test the connection, Sharperlight will, when required, create all the tables. If we go down the list, we can see SAP Business One and the various different connection types. In this case, I'm using Microsoft SQL Server, and I chose Database SQL Authentication. Here is the server name and the database, which is SBO Common, and of course the username and password. I may also want to use Microsoft Windows Authentication, in which case it uses whatever the current account is to connect to the database. If you use this option, just make sure that the Sharperlight service, which is under Windows Services, runs with a service account. Otherwise, it won't be able to connect to the database. So if we just have a look at the Sharperlight service, you can see that you can set that service up to run as an account. So that's just a warning that if you choose Windows Authentication to connect to Sharperlight or SAP Business One, make sure that you set the Sharperlight service up with an account that can connect to those databases. Otherwise, it'll fail. Moving on, you can see that we've got connection types for SAP HANA. Now, SAP HANA has a number of different connection types. They have a ADO.NET connector, and they also have a ODBC driver to connect to SAP HANA. Now, the important thing here is that when you create a connection, you should always avoid the word localhost. The reason being that the SAP DI API library is not very good at resolving localhost. So always put in a server name or the IP address, otherwise it's going to fail. It'll successfully connect here because these drivers can resolve it. It's just the SAP DI API that has trouble with those sorts of settings. If you're connecting to SAP HANA and using the ODBC drivers, there's another setting that's very important, and that is the ODBC Data Source Administrator Connection Pool settings. Basically, the ODBC driver for SAP HANA is very slow if you don't enable connection pooling. If you come to the connection pooling tab and HDB ODBC driver name, and then enable pool connections to this driver. Through testing, we found that around about 600 is the optimal number. Without this, queries to HANA will be about 20 times slower than what they should be. A very important setting. Okay, once you have your local connections tested and working, you can close client setup and then move on to the next stage, which is site setup. And select site setup. This is where you can create accounts and secure the system and also load licenses. Now initially there'll be an admin account with no password, so we sign in with that. Looking at the users, you can see that there's various types. For example, admin here with no password, and then you've got a Active Directory account and also Active Directory groups. Now normally what you would do is trust your administrator account so that you don't need to remember a password the next time you come into site setup. So here I have a AD account, and that will allow me to single sign on without entering a password. You can add accounts by selecting new and then either just typing in the account, or if it's an Active Directory account, put in the domain and then browse for the Active Directory group or username. The way Active Directory groups work is that a user will come under an Active Directory group, and if they belong to more than one group, their permissions are merged. So under here you can see the various settings for SAP Business One and other systems. So if you didn't want that Active Directory group to have permissions to SAP Business One, you would simply remove that access level here. Up the top here we have licenses, and this is where you would load your license file. There are videos that cover the concepts of licenses, but let's explain the basics here. There are two types of users, named and concurrent. Named being that you've got a predetermined list of people who can access the system, and concurrent meaning that anyone who can sign in, is just that there's a limit on how many people can concurrently at the same time sign in. Then these are broken into two categories of full users, meaning that they can access Excel, Publisher and the web, and then web-only users, meaning that they're just consuming reports in the web. So basically you load your license and that gives you access to the system. If there is no license, then Sharperlight will still work, but in a limited fashion, given that you will get only the first 99 rows in list reports. All the applications in Sharperlight are available with a license or without a license, but Scheduler is the exception. It needs at least 5 users before Scheduler can be utilized. Now let's go into some of the setup details for SAP Business One. First of all, have a look at product settings and then SAP Business One. You can see here the global settings. So this is for all users and groups in general. So what would you like to make the default company? Let's go to Query Builder to explore the concept of default companies. You can see that in Query Builder, when we select a company, it lists the companies in SAP Business One, but at the top here we've got default. So the concept of default is if you create a report pack and you want to deploy it to various customers, those customers may have different companies. And so what would happen is you would have to go through your report pack and adjust the company for that client. But if you created the report pack using the default company, then you can deploy your report pack and it'll work on a client side based on what they've defined as their default company. That global setting for the default company is done here, and at the moment I haven't defined the default company, so it's just picked the first one in the list, which is happened to be in this case company test. But if I wanted the UK company to be the default, I would put in here for example SBO demo GB. Alright, let's move on to the next setting, which is to exclude companies from Sharperlight. So this is a comma delimited list, and you would put in the database name for each database that you would want to exclude from Sharperlight. So if I wanted to exclude this test company from the list, I would type in SBO company test 1, comma, and then whatever the next one is. It's not uncommon to have various training and test companies in your system, and this is the best way to exclude them. Right, let's move on to Writeback now. Here we have the DI API settings. You can see that the first property here is the version. So I'm currently using 9.3 64-bit. Now I recommend that all DI API should be done via the 64-bit version of the library. This is because it's more stable and it has more memory, and it also means that we don't have to install the 32-bit version of Sharperlight just for the DI API. So some of the questions I get here is, well, I have other applications that require the 32-bit version of the DI API, so I have to install Sharperlight as 32-bit. That's not the case. You can actually install the 64-bit version of the DI API and have it coexist with the 32-bit version. So the general rule here is always use 64-bit version of DI API and 64-bit version of Sharperlight. Now you may think, well, I've got a 32-bit version of Excel. The 64-bit version of Sharperlight also has a 32-bit Excel add-in, so there is no reason to install 32-bit at all. It just makes things complicated. So here we have the version of the DI API. Then we have the database connection details. So we have a user account and password, and here we have what version of SQL Server that we have SAP installed on. So it could be 2014 SQL Server, it could be 2016 SQL Server. So basically you put in whatever version that is. If it's HANA, you would put in the word HANA there, and that would be your basic connection details done. Moving on from there, let's move down to the user accounts. So each user account, let's have a look at this account here called Manager, and you can see that Manager belongs to group 2, and if we open that up now, at the top here it says this is using the group for its policy. So here's our user Manager, and then it belongs to the user group. So there may be another user in the list that also belongs to that group as well. Let's go back to administrator. So here's administrator, and it belongs to the administration group. And if we have a look at SAP settings, you can see that here also we have a default company. So anyone who belongs in this group can have their own default company. So for example, you may have the UK people default to the UK, and those in Germany default to Germany, for example. So that's where you would set their default company. Below that you have user mapping. I'll come back to that later, because what's more important are these settings down below here. Since we're on Writeback, let's continue that topic. We have our connection details under product settings, but down here what we're saying is what account do we use in SAP Business One when we're doing Writebacks. So anyone who is a member of this group if they were to do writebacks via Excel or Scheduler, for example, they would use this account. So the next question would be if I sign in as admin and I do a writeback, I'm doing it as manager. The question is, how do I determine who was doing that writeback, given that they're all sharing the same credentials? The answer is under here in Writeback. If I select SAP Business One, there's a section here called Writeback History. And what that allows me to do is every time someone's done a writeback is to keep an audit trail of who they were and when they did the writeback and what they did the writeback to. So by default that's set to none, so we keep no history, but you could set it to everything. So whether the writeback succeeds, fails, we're going to keep a record of it. Now I suggest that you don't keep all the details about every record they wrote back, because that could be quite large. We just want to know who they are, so you would leave that unticked. And since we don't want to keep records forever, we could set the clear down options. For example, 7 days is around about 10,000 minutes. We could say 10,000, so we just keep a record for 7 days. That's how we could keep an audit. Sharperlight has a system product, and then from there you can actually write queries, not against SAP, but the information that is in Sharperlight. Here we can view the latest writebacks that were done. So you can see that here's my account, there's a table I did the writeback to, there's the company and what happened. For example, there was an error on this particular writeback. Coming back to the settings, we just explained writeback, so the user signs in with this account or they come under this AD group, and then whatever they do gets associated with this SAP user. But there's some other settings here as well. One of them is use SAP company security. The idea here is if we set this to true, whatever the security arrangements are in SAP Business One will inherit them. So whatever the SAP Business One account is restricted to as far as companies are concerned, Sharperlight will do the same. But for this to work, we need to make sure that this account here matches what it is in SAP Business One, or we provide a mapping up here. So even though we're signing in with an AD account, we can say that this correlates to a particular account in SAP. For example, this one here. Whatever account that is, the security is applied to that. Now SAP also has the concept of AD accounts, and if you set up a link between your SAP Business One and AD accounts, Sharperlight supports that as well. So it gets a little bit more complicated in that scenario, and it's all explained here in the notes. But you can do mapping like this, or if this account here it happens to be an AD account and it matches the account that you're mapped to in SAP Business One, or then it's all just going to work, and then this company security is going to flow through. So the best way to test it all is to set it up, sign out, sign back in, and check this company list here so that it reflects what you're seeing in SAP Business One. Next is company security. So again, we can just put a list of companies. So we're not relying on these settings to do the job. We can just put a list of companies in, and whoever's in that group will be restricted to that list of companies. Now if you were to turn on both of these, put a list in as well as do SAP Business One security, it combines the two together. Since we're discussing security, let's go back to Writeback and have a look at another level of security. So we discussed previously how we could do auditing, keeping track of what writebacks are done by what user accounts. But there's another setting up the top here where we can select a particular company like this, and then select the tables that we're restricting accounts to. If I wanted to restrict a particular set of users to just journal entries, I would select journal, and under security I can then apply the groups that have access to this. For example, just the administrator and group 1 have access to journal entry. Then we come to the next table and we come to security, and we can assign individual users or groups to that table. I recommend that you don't use this option unless it's absolutely required, because it does get complex. The end result is that a user will try to do a write back and they'll get an error message saying that they've denied permissions, and then you need to come into the individual table and work out why it's done. That's at a user or group level. There is another location where you can deny access to writebacks. If we look at the user groups, which appear up under the users as well, come into group 1, and we could say, for example, group 1 in general doesn't have writeback permissions. So we would come over to here, allow writeback, and set that to false, and that would be a general setting. If a user belonged to 2 AD groups and one of them was set to no writeback and one was set to true, that they were allowed to write back, well, the end result would be that they would be able to do write back. Notice that the SAP Business One product settings is set as red at the moment. This is because we've changed these settings and that requires a service restart. So just be aware of that. Okay, let's move on now to actually starting the service and getting writeback working. Sharperlight creates a Windows service. At the moment, this is set as manual. Generally, you would set this to automatic so that if someone restarted the box, the service would start up automatically without you manually starting it. As we mentioned before, normally you would set the logon account as a service account, especially if you're using Windows authentication to connect to your databases. Now, one of the issues that comes up with these types of accounts is permissions. Very often a IT department will create a AD service account and they think they have the right permissions, but more often than not it doesn't have enough permissions to run this service, and as a consequence of that, when we start the service it'll fail. So we'll have a look at what happens if we start the service and it fails. So what I'm going to do is deliberately break some of the connection details and have a look. Here's our SAP Business One, and I'll just put some invalid connection details in here, and I'll start the service. Now if I was to go to the web channel and have a look at the index page for that service, so I'm just refreshing it like this, what will happen is it'll just spin around and the web page will never come up. Well, it may come up after some time saying that there's a connection error because our connection details are invalid. But let's have a look at the Windows event log and we'll see what the problem the service is having. So if I come into event logs, Windows logs, application, and you can see that Sharperlight has made a couple of entries here. So md.ws. So most of the Sharperlight entries start with md or Sharperlight. So this is the Windows service, and it's made an entry in here that it couldn't connect to SAP Business One because we have invalid connection details. So if you're having problems with your service, check the Windows log, and more often than not it'll be connection details. The second reason will be because the service account that you've associated with the Windows service doesn't have sufficient permissions to run. That's this one here. Basically, if you give the service account local admin rights on the application server, that will be sufficient more often than not. Okay, let's fix these connection details and try it again. And this time when we look at the event log, you'll see that there's some entries in here saying that the service is starting, and these are the addresses for the service, and there's no errors this time, so everything started correctly. So if we come in and we were to click on this one that says /index, we would be able to see the web channel. So this is the main index page for Sharperlight, and of course you need to sign in. It could be your AD account or your named account that you've set up, and from here you can navigate to see what reports are published, also how many writebacks have been set up, scheduled jobs, etc. Now let's have a look at some more complications with setting up DI API. If I come here to Writeback and list, I can list all the writebacks to SAP Business One through the web channel. I can also do writebacks through Excel, but let's have a look at writebacks through the web channel first, because setting up the writebacks requires that Sharperlight register the libraries for DI API, and the best way to register those libraries is through the web channel because of permissions. So let's just explore some of the ways we can test and ensure that the registration process was successful. Here is the list of the writebacks, and if we choose SAP Business One as our product, in most cases that'll be the only system you have, there's a list of all the tables for all the companies. So usually for a test you would have a test company already in mind, but what I do is I just narrow the list down to price list, because that's the table that has the fewest number of fields in it. Here's price list. I'd like to use this company for my test. Now I have item price lists and price lists. I like to use the price list table because it has the least amount of fields in it. There are two icons, one's the grid and one's the form. So I'm going to use the form to bring up a basic data entry. So if I click on the button, I can get a list of the current price lists that are in that system, and what I can do is create another test entry by typing in X and maybe some unique number, setting the base be 1 and 1, and then clicking submit. Now if the registration process is successful, what will happen is it will write data back into SAP Business One. But if any of the credentials that I've set up are inaccurate, then it'll fail. So you can see here that it's failed, and it was due to no SAP licenses. So obviously you need to set up SAP so that you assign licenses to Writeback, and also you need to enable, I think it's the SDK setting for a particular account. So I'm using manager at the moment, so that needs to be set up so it can have access to. Right, so I'm going to correct that and try this again. Okay, so now I've sorted out the licenses and I've restarted the Sharperlight service and I've rerun this test again. So I've put in some very simple test data and hit submit, and I've got a successful committed data message at the bottom. And if I go back to the price list, you can see now there's a entry here for X12. And of course I can go into SAP Business One and delete that record if required, but because I've used a test company, I'm really just using this to confirm that Writeback is working. Now let's go back and set some invalid connection details in site setup and try this Writeback again and see what happens with these error messages down the bottom. So basically the error messages are broken into two groups. One where there's a registration type error with the library, so you may get a range error, or you may get invalid connection details, and then the third type is SAP DI API errors. And more often than not, they're not very descriptive about the type of error it is, but a bit of Googling on the SAP DI API error is always helpful to get to the root cause of the error. But again, Sharperlight does the basic validation and then passes over to SAP DI API. If there are some user-defined fields in SAP, they'll also appear in this list. In product settings, I'm deliberately going to break these details now by setting some invalid connection details, and let's restart the service and try this again and see how it affects Writeback. I'm going to restart the service again, refresh this page. Let's try it again. So I'll put in X12, 1 and 1 and submit. Now initially it may take a bit of time for it to start up given that we've restarted the service, but you can see here it's come back with an error almost straight away saying that we was unable to connect to the SBO common database. So that's as a result of putting those invalid connection details in. So that's one of the common errors. The other one would of course be that if we come down to users, I'm signing in as admin, and if we look under admin, we've got SAP Business One. If we hadn't set the SAP application user account to manager and give it a valid password, we would have also failed during that writeback. So I'm going to correct these details now and restart the service again. Now I'd like to explain what happens if the registration of the SAP DI API library fails. So generally we get a range error in here, and no matter how many times we try to do writebacks, they just fail. In that scenario, please follow the following steps. So what we would do is we would stop the service like this. We then come to the application menu, and from there we can select Datamodel Installer. So obviously the registration failed, and no matter how many times we do writeback, it just won't work. So what we want to do is recompile the SAP Business One data model. The reason why we're doing this is because the initial compile may have failed because a service was running or one of the applications was running at the time when we were trying to compile this. By doing this, we're ensuring that it is compiled correctly. Once that's finished, the next step is, instead of starting the Sharperlight service, what we'll do is start a test version of the service, which is this entry here. We'll need admin rights to do this, so I've just clicked on that. So make sure you've got admin rights when you click on it, and this is going to start the service exactly as we had done before, but using your local admin rights to do it. And usually this is enough for Sharperlight to register the SAP DI API library correctly. So just as before, we go to the main link, and from there you select Writeback and list. We do a search for a price because we're going to use price list as our test case. You have your various companies, you can filter them down here or just select them from the list. So I'm going back to my entry price list. There's our test form, and I'm going to type in X12, 1 and 1 and click the submit button. Now when I click the submit button, Sharperlight will obviously register the DI API library and connect to it and then try to write that data back. Now you can see that it's come back with an error message, but that's a valid error message because this record already exists. So we know that the DI API library is working. So by using this test service, we can get around the issues of permissions and other issues that may prevent the library from working. So I'm just going to change the record that I'm writing back to is X13 and submit that, and it was successful. So once that's successful, what we can do is stop the test version of the service like this, go back to the service and start the real version of it. The reason why we don't run the test service all the time is because the Windows service can start up automatically if someone reboots the system. Of course, you need to set that to automatic. Now Writeback is set up. What I can do then is go to Excel and do a test in there as well. Creating a new workbook, going to the add-in, and I could put some test data here, but because it's just a test, I'll go to Writeback and I'll enter the data directly in. So our product is SAP Business One. Our company is Australia. The table that we're writing back to is price list. You notice that the user-defined tables can also be written back to. So I'm just going to do a search for price. There's price list. And if I do X12, if I want to know what valid values there are, I can use the lookup. It's 1 and 1 and 1. Now Excel has a concept of driver fields. So this one with the black star means that if this is blank, then no data is written back. So when I did that test, nothing was written back. So I need a value in here. So I'm just going to put 1 in and click execute. And it's taking a bit of time, but it wrote back some data. And as you can see, just as before, we're getting this record already exists, which is a good outcome. So let's change that to 15 and execute again. And it is successfully written back. So if I want to see what's been written back, I can create a query. So I'm going to use the table, SAP Business One, set the company, and the table will be price list, and let's output them all and drop that back into Excel, and there's the last entry I just wrote back. Next, I'd like to explain some of the complications when writing back with user-defined fields. So if we have a look at the Writeback here, select the product again, and then the company, which can be a cell reference back into the spreadsheet, we select the table. Now, if this table has user-defined fields, for example, the AR invoice table, those user-defined fields will appear in the list. By the way, the stars mean that these are mandatory values. Now, the user-defined fields appear in the list, and we map it back to various cells or columns in the Excel spreadsheet, for example, like this. But the issue comes from the user-defined fields may not be uniform across companies. So if I had 2 companies and they had different user-defined fields, that writeback's not going to work for both companies. So the point I'm getting across here is if you're doing writebacks to different companies, make sure that those companies have the same user-defined fields. This concept also comes into play when you're doing company consolidation. For example, we do a report and we select sales AR and we select various user-defined fields, which usually appear down at the bottom under a folder called user-defined fields. If we were to run this report and we were to make the company a cell reference like this, so I'll just make that point back to that cell there, and we give the report a name and we run it. And let's just change this to be a company that has some data, and I'll add a few more columns. Okay, so now we have some data. Now if I was to change this to the UK, the report runs fine. But if I was to select Australia and the UK, and the UK didn't have a user-defined field that was in the original starting company, what we would get is a SQL error saying that this user-defined field doesn't exist in the UK. I hope that makes sense. So again, the rule is that we create the same user-defined fields in both companies that we want to write back to or report off at the same time. While we're still on the topic of writeback, let's have a look at scheduler. So scheduler is used for a number of different things. Most users will Probably use it just for distributing reports, emailing them out, for example. Here's some examples from the training videos. So here we have some actions, and what it's doing is it's querying the companies in SAP Business One and looping around and executing a published report and saving that as a PDF using the company name and the file name and today's date. And then it's coming down to email, and it's putting a nice HTML email message in. You can put variables in there, for example, so many days overdue, and it's attaching the files and sending and emailing those out. That's one case in which you would use scheduler. Another case would be where I'll just create a new schedule job. We'd come to actions and we'd create new actions. What we could do is use Writeback. So if I select Writeback as my action, I can target SAP Business One, and the company, which could be a variable, is this, and our table is, let's stay with price list, just for given that it's got the least amount of fields. And so now I've defined my Writeback, and that's my table. And here are the fields that I'm going to write back to. By the way, in here we can say that we'd like to calculate the value that's going into that field, or designate what column from a CSV file it's coming from, etc. But what I'd like to explain now is the source side. So that's what we're writing back to, and this is where it's coming from. So it can come from a CSV file, it could come from Excel. Of course, you could do it inside Excel. We could base it on a SQL statement, a JSON payload. But in this scenario here, I'm going to say, let's base it on a query. So here we define our query. And if we define a query that has the right number of columns and the values, then that's going to write it back into SAP Business One. Of course, down the bottom here, we've got the ability to create a status file to say, if something's wrong or there's a validation error, to let us know what went wrong. So the interesting part here is we could, for example, query a CSV file, or if it's Salesforce, we could query Salesforce and write back data into SAP Business One. But let's say it's a CSV file. What we could do is change it to CSV. We can say that's the file we'd like to write back. And if that CSV file came from an FTP site, what we could do is add another action here and say, let's download that file from an FTP site. Put that first in the list so we get the file, and then we transfer the file back into SAP Business One. There's lots of different types of actions here. So we could query SAP Business One and maybe send a message to Microsoft Teams with maybe a list of aged debtors that need working on. So it's up to you really how you want to do this, whether it's workflow or just transferring data to and from SAP Business One, or just email bursting in general. Quite a few options there. Next, let's have a look at Publisher and some of the functionality involved in deploying dashboards. Basically, dashboards can be exported and imported as files. So if we double click on a published report back, it will automatically import it. And this goes for other things in Sharperlight like reporting rows, filter mapping, etc., which we haven't covered in this video. So you would import your report back, and if you're using default companies, well then basically that report pack would work on a client side. Let's just create a report from scratch. I've clicked on new, I go to edit, I would select SAP Business One, and we will select our table. Now in the case of sales AR, it combines all the document types under one table, which is quite interesting. So, but what I'm going to do here is select GL transactions. I'm just doing a simple report for test purposes only. Under here we can find the account name, and the account type, and I'll bring out the amount. This is test data, so I'll bring back from the beginning of time. This keyword here, period, just means the current period for that company. And I can preview the data, press OK, apply, and then view. And then it'll throw us into the web page, and we can submit and view that data. Of course, you can add tabs, you can add subtotals, hide and show filters, etc. But that gets the general concept of how you can publish reports. This is the code for the report, and I can give the report a group and also a category, a title, etc. And the reports can be secured, and that's done under the security tab. And just like we saw in site setup, you can apply groups to them as well as assign the report just to a particular user. Over on the side here, we can get links. So if you're a developer, maybe you want to get the JSON payload so that you can roll your own and create your own custom UI for these reports just using the data from them. So if I come back to options again, we've got, I can stack those filters, put one on a row and refresh that report. So next, let's have a look at Power BI and how we can take these published reports and use them as data sets to feed Power BI. If you were to right click on the publisher list, you'll get a menu, and under there we can find links. So under links, you'll see that there's an entry for Power BI. So if I click on that, it'll give us the URL link to discover all the data sets that are in Sharperlight and expose them to Power BI. So I'm just going to click OK there and then start Power BI. What I'll do now is use Get Data, because Sharperlight exposes a connector to Power BI so we can discover those data sets. So I've just set Get Data, and if we scroll down, there should be an entry in here for Sharperlight. If you use the other menu, I think you'll be able to find it faster. So there's our connector for Sharperlight, and we'll connect. And the next thing we need to do is provide the URL to discover the data sets. So that's the URL I just copied from Publisher, so I put that in. Next, it's come up with this list here, which is the folders of which are the groups that we've applied to publish reports. And you can see that I've got quite a few groups, and down here I've got the SAP Business One demo. So let's just choose a couple of these, and you can see there's a preview of the data set that we're getting out of SAP. So these are live queries. Of course, with Power BI, in most cases you need to set up the gateway so it can upload it to the cloud and then stage the data ready for displaying from memory in Power BI. Essentially, we're using Sharperlight to access the data and stage it for Power BI. Now there's various ways to set up security for Power BI, and by default I'm using NTLM or Windows Authentication so that it's easier for me to integrate with Power BI. So let's have a look at those settings. In Client Setup, we have our local connections where we define our database connections, and then down the bottom we have our service, and these are the connection details for our service. And as an end result of that, we get that service as appearing as a web page, and also something that clients can connect to via Excel. So the important parts of this are what protocol you want to set up. So in most cases it'll be HTTP if it's on an intranet. If it's on an internet going public, then you'd want to secure it with HTTPS and get yourself a SSL certificate. There's an article online to explain how that's done. So this is our default port. If it's HTTP, it's port 80, and 443 for SSL. So here it's set up for authentication. Now by default, it's set to default, which is mixed authentication, so we can do things like admin or AD accounts, etc. But for Power BI, I find that is quite temperamental, and if I set it to NTLM, it seems to be quite happy because it's using Windows accounts. The other part of this is if we come to site setup, you can see that on these user accounts, if I was to use something other than an AD account, I can create feed keys. So if I wanted to use Power BI with this admin account, I could create a feed key, and that's the feed key here, and I would put it under the security feed key options to sign in with this account here. I know Power BI can use basic authentication as well, but generally we find it's quite problematic. Usually it's AD accounts or feed keys that work. Next, I'd like to explain what's involved in setting up a client-only install. So initially at the beginning of this video, we talked about setting up the application server. So the application server had local connections to SAP Business One, and it had a local connection to Sharperlight's database, and maybe it had DI APIs configured as well. So the connections are done, and down the bottom here we set up the service, and the service has a code, and if it's public we put in our domain name here, and we designate what protocol to use and what ports to use. Based on that, the application server is ready to be consumed by clients as long as the Windows service is up and running. But from the client's point of view, they have a slightly different set of connection details. If we were to reverse this around and pretend that this was the client, during the install we would select client only in the 3 boxes that appears. So there's a complete install everything option, but there's a client only install option. So if we were to do the client only option, what would happen then is when we come into client setup, we wouldn't see local connections. That would not be in the list, and the only thing that we would be able to see would be this entry here, remote connections. And the idea is that you would come into remote connections and you would enter in the name of the server or the public domain address for that server if it's on the internet, and the code, and it's optional whether you set up a password or not. That's an additional layer of security. And if those details were correct, you would be able to test that connection. Now if it was a slightly different version, that's fine, it would still work. And this performance test would give you an idea of how many packets per second your connection can handle. The number of packets per second is more important if you're doing Excel reporting. Imagine a client is working from home and they're using Excel. If they've got Excel bringing back tables, that's one query. If you had a connection speed that allowed 10 queries per second, that's your bottleneck. If you've got lots of small little queries based on balances, for example, they'd have a slower experience based on the results you see here. Okay, so I have a working remote connection, so I'm going to enable that. Obviously they don't have local connections, and we go OK. And from there it's sign in as per usual. So we would start up Excel, for example, and sign in and work away. Now it's possible to have more than one remote connection. So if you have, for example, UAT, dev, production or training environments, the user can choose which one they want to report out of. This scenario is also used in data consolidation scenarios. So maybe you have a London office and a Tokyo office and a New York office. You can remote connect to all of those systems and then pull them back into Excel, for example. So if I have a look at the product list, you can see it's a little bit different from before in that we're connecting to the Sharperlight UK instance. If I had 2 remote connections, I would see two sets in there, and I can choose which one I want to pull the data from. With sign on, you could have 3 remote connections, and if your account was valid in all 3, you would see 3 active connections. If it was only valid in one, you would just get the one that your account is valid on. Next, I'd like to talk about creating multiple instances of Sharperlight on the application server. So if you have training or a dev environment and a production environment, or you just want to have multiple instances of SAP Business One, what you can do is use instance management to create totally separate instances of Sharperlight on the same box. So what you would do is click New, create a new instance. Let's call this one Testing. And over here we have client setup, our Datamodel Installer, etc. So it's a totally separate instance of Sharperlight. So it has its own connection details and configuration. So I'll just click Apply, go into here. So for this instance, we would define what Sharperlight database to use and what SAP Business One server and database to use. And in this way we can create test environments or multi-tenant client setups. The multi-tenant client setups would normally share no databases, they'd all be separate. In fact, in most cases you'd never share a Sharperlight database or a SAP Business One database. So this video has become quite long, so I'd like to bring it to a close and just reiterate some of the points that you should check when configuring and setting up SAP Business One for Sharperlight. Some of the points are, when setting up Writeback, that the registration of the library is quite temperamental. So we need to get our permissions right, we need to get the connection details right, avoid things like localhost. If we're connecting to SAP HANA, always make sure that you enable connection pooling in the ODBC driver, otherwise it'll run extremely slow. If we're reporting or doing writeback to UDFs, make sure that the UDFs are uniform across companies if you're planning to use those writebacks or reports over multiple companies. You've got a set of 5 in company A, and you also want to use that report or writeback for company B. Make sure that you have the same set in both, otherwise you'll get an error saying that the UDF doesn't exist. In most cases, clients will probably use Active Directory and Active Directory groups. So for this reason, I recommend site setup is set up to use an Active Directory group so that IT departments can add ID accounts to the Active Directory group externally from Sharperlight, and it'll just inherit those permissions and people can single sign into Sharperlight. When defining connections to databases and you're using Windows authentication, remember that the Windows service uses the account that it's associated with to connect to your databases. So whatever service account you set up for the Windows service, it also has permissions to connect to the databases, and it has the right level of permissions to run as a service. If you're looking for materials on basically how to use Sharperlight, you can find them on the Sharperlight website under posts, and also in the manuals and guides section. If you Google for Sharperlight in general on a topic, you'll usually find the answers to your questions. For example, if I Google here Sharperlight Writeback, I should find that there's a number of articles and also videos as well. You can go directly to YouTube to find videos on Sharperlight on various subjects. This video hasn't covered all the subjects, it's very much focused on configuration and setup, targeted at someone who's setting up the system and getting it configured for clients. If it comes to basic training, there's plenty of other videos and posts and training manuals to cover that topic. Let's bring the video to a close, and thank you for staying with me.